Welcome to Taste of Truth Tuesdays, where we'll be serving up bite-sized conversations on all things fitness, nutrition, mindset, and spirituality. So grab your headphones and get ready to taste the truth with us every Tuesday. Subscribe now on your favorite podcast platform because every bite counts. Hey, welcome back to Taste of Truth Tuesdays. Last week, I got real about my own journey within multi-level marketing, how I believed in freedom, empowerment, and community. I even tattooed "Trust the Process" on my forearm as a daily reminder. But I also shared the cracks I discovered along the way, emotional manipulation, silencing of doubts, and the subtle ways that magical thinking takes over. And this week, we're taking that conversation even deeper. I am thrilled to be joined by Robert L. FitzPatrick, author of Ponzinomics and False Profits, and one of the leading voices exposing MLMs for what they truly are: predatory business models, not opportunities. Robert has been sounding the alarm for decades, providing the data, language, and insight people need to see these systems clearly. We're diving into why no MLM can ever truly work, how they exploit cultural and spiritual hooks, the brutal economic reality for almost all participants, and the deeper impact on identity, trust, and community. So whether you've been involved in an MLM, or you know someone who has, or you just want to understand the mechanics behind these schemes, this episode is packed with insights that you don't want to miss. And of course, I have to include a disclaimer. These views expressed in this episode are solely of the host and guest and do not necessarily reflect the official policy or position of any company, organization, or individual mentioned. This episode contains personal opinions and interpretations protected under fair use for commentary and critique. Any claims about MLM companies are intended to address industry-wide practices and may not apply to the specific company discussed. Statements by distributors or former distributors reflect personal experiences and opinions, not official company views. Sources discussed are publicly available. Listeners are encouraged to conduct their own research. Thank you so much, Robert FitzPatrick, for joining us today. It is a real pleasure to have such an expert on the podcast to break down something that I've talked about a lot. So would you just, kick it off? I wanted you to mention a little bit about the spark, because you've been sounding the alarm about MLMs for decades and long before it was even common to call them cult-like environments. And you describe in Ponzinomics and a little bit and also in False Profits, you had your own brush with these schemes. And it was called the airplane game back in the 1980s. And that's what being a part of that experience is what sent you into the frenzy of research to make and write these books. And that's what I can relate to so much in my own deep self-examination after leaving both isogenics and high control religion. So would you take us back to any of that you want to explore with us? Was there a specific moment for you that opened your eyes? And I know you talk about this in your book, which I highly recommend to our readers, but, was there something that you're just like, wow, this is fundamentally fraudulent and this is systemic?
Yeah. Well, let's put me in the context of the history of multi-level marketing, let's say, because it existed, it was created in late 1940s after World War II in California. And it was created by two guys who took over a little vitamin company. Okay, and it grew, and then the government tried to shut it down, and then that didn't happen, which we can talk about how that didn't happen. But then it mushroomed primarily through the Amway Corporation. And so the Amway Corporation sort of got its green light of legality in 1979. And then it spread after that and it began to morph. In other words, when Amway was so-called legalized, the concept of an endless chain, which previous to that was understood to be a classic fraudulent scheme, proposition, a trick, a math trick, and it relies on exponential expansion. So, but the idea being that if I recruited 5 people and got their money, they could go do the same. This was the basis of chain letters, and chain letters developed in the 1930s. So this type of scam has been popularized for a long time, and I step into one in the late 1980s. Haplessly, didn't know anything about pyramid schemes or endless chains, really. At the time, I was working in industry. I was a consultant in manufacturer distributor relations. I was an independent consultant, had my own office in South Florida, and but I was involved, which we will probably touch on, in what I would call sort of new age or new thought thinking, very popular at that time, especially. And it also at that time had already begun to merge with a corporate mentality promoting entrepreneurship, free agency, exalting the CEO as this heroic American figure, and portraying work as the fullest expression of your life, where you put in your passion and you find your vision and your purpose in life in work. Now, that's a relatively new idea. In the past, people didn't think of work and money, particularly as their mission and purpose in life. It was family, community, things like that. It could be private interests that they might have, but it wasn't really their work. So that was the milieu that I was in. And this thing called the airplane game swept into South Florida, and they are now classified as gifting schemes, very close to multi-level marketing, except they are not constructed as companies. They are just sort of social movements, almost like a club, like a social club. And people are given the structure. It has 4 levels, and they double. Each level doubles. The 4th level gives the money that they put in to the first person at the top. It splits. It keeps expanding. But it was presented in this language of salvation, of enlightenment, of fulfillment, destiny. It played upon the ideas that we are destined to become prosperous. Prosperous was somehow equated with happiness, prosperity, financial prosperity. So in the cold light of analysis, it sounds ridiculous, absurd, fantastical, childlike, fantasy.
Yeah.
But in that context that I'm describing, with the endless chain, multi-level marketing, chain letters, and then the exaltation of wealth and business and entrepreneurship, and somehow creating wealth and manifesting wealth being equated with happiness and fulfillment, it actually sounded, I won't say plausible, it sounded like it was meant to be somehow, like it was a body of knowledge, a manifestation of knowledge that we were bound to, if we had our eyes open, we would find.
Yeah.
And we found it.
Yep.
So it became a mass mania, a literal mass mania. Thousands and thousands of people joined in the area where I lived in South Florida. My friends, many of them, all called me. You have to get in on this. Come to a meeting. So it didn't last very long. It collapsed partly under its weight of saturation, but it was actually prosecuted by the local sheriff's department, who identified it as a pyramid scheme. So there were articles in the newspaper, and then they actually came and arrested some people at these house meetings, which that ended it quickly.
Yeah.
Which that shocking and abrupt end to it prompted me, you were talking about the spark, prompted me to look at, of course, then the reality of it, the mathematical you know, for one person to make money, they got money from 8 others. For the 8 to get their money, there had to be 64 more. The 64 had to have each 8 people under them. Well, you can see very quickly that could not work. So it was unsustainable. It was a trick. And moreover, you could plot it out on a chart. It didn't take a math genius to do this, that at any given time, at least 90% would be in the unpaid ranks. Always. If it ran for 1,000,000 years, it would still be that the total number of people who joined would be 90% not getting paid. So it could never fulfill its promise of everyone gaining prosperity. That was what I reasonably logically figured out. So now I thought, well, we need to talk about this all, because this was a communal social thing. I discovered many of my friends did not want to talk about it, even though during that brief period, there was mass euphoria, a kind of dream-like quality. Everything was better. And I thought, what was that? It was like being in love.
Yeah.
What was that? Well, and I started looking at it. I realized I had been walking around, as all of us really were, in a state of great anxiety, actually. What am I going to do? How am I going to survive? Will my work, which I was an independent contractor, will it sustain me?
Yeah.
What about retirement? What about my family? I had that. My parents were getting older. What's going to happen to them? What am I going to have to do to take care of them? So, and I'm getting older, and you're facing your own old age. So all of these things are weighing on you privately as an individual. And then along this thing comes to say, well, first of all, this is going to make you wealthy. So all kinds of problems will disappear now with your wealth. Time freedom, security.
Yep.
Anything's possible. So that really, fascinated me, that this promise of wealth unleashed like a drug. It released all this anxiety, which I didn't realize I was carrying around. And we were all collectively carrying it around. It delivered us. So that's why I entitled the book, False Profits, seeking, deliverance and multi-level marketing.
This is so well articulated. I flew through the book. I probably read it in less than a week, no joke. And I have lots of pages folded, lots of highlights, lots of notes in the sidelines, because I could just relate to everything you just said. And, especially as a male, you have got a lot of pressure as the provider. But I can relate to everything you said in regards to financial pressures, because I was single, living in Portland, Oregon, a boss babe, don't need no man, the extreme radical feminism side of stuff. And I was like, I want to buy a home. I want to have a farm. I don't want to keep renting. I was very panicked. And so I'd actually just lost my job at Fulcrum Fitness for pushing back on higher pay and kind of speaking up for everybody. And then they fired me, but then did up the pay. But that's when my upline was like, or my soon-to-be upline was like, this is the perfect time for you to invest. This is a better opportunity because, and that's so right. I was very panicked because not only did I still have all those pressures, but then I just lost my job for standing up for everybody. And that's when
let me just interject something here. So the description I gave there of the airplane game, as I said, it was not described, it was not presented as a company, a business, a job. So, but embedded in it, at the heart of it, was a plan, a method of creating vast wealth for everyone. And it was based on infinity, expansion, abundance, unlimited, and so on. How? Well, through that chart, which, once you get this vision of prosperity for all and for you, you stop there. You don't get your calculator out and say, wait a minute, 8 times. Yes.
This chart?
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah.
So
I'll
4 levels, and there's 8 at the bottom there.
Mhm.
Yeah. So those 8, of course, it splits, and then each one of the 2 at the top become now the 2 at the second level go to the top, the 4, and each side has to go recruit 8 more.
Yep.
That's 16, and so on. Well, you don't do that. See, that's what it subverted right away. It subverted my critical thinking, a simple due diligence. I didn't do that. Now, as I thought, well, this is something quite incredible in my life. I mean, I had some life experience already, quite a lot, and I thought, uh, how is it that I didn't see this? What did they do? So that provoked the examination. While I was doing this, along comes multi-level marketing. So again, now we're moving up into the 90s, 1990s, and I discovered, I didn't know this at the time, multi-level marketing had been around since the 1950 approximately, even a little before. And I had always kind of thought of it at that time as I had heard of Amway.
Yep.
I always thought of it as a sort of blue collar, maybe evangelistic thing, something with churches. I didn't think it was something be popular or interesting to people like me. Let's call me a kind of yuppie. Had a nice new car and I had an office and, was dressing for success and that sort of thing. And so I didn't think it was, well, what happened is that multi-level marketing right about the 90s morphed up into the white collar. It moved from blue collar to white collar. Why? Well, the blue collar were getting wiped out.
Yeah.
They
Saturated.
started getting wiped out in the 60s, 70s, even up into the 80s. And then quickly by the 90s, it moved up into the corporations where they started downsizing, right sizing, outsourcing.
Mm.
And all of a sudden, there were a lot of white collar people who saw, oh my God, the corporate ladder is not available to me. The professions were closing off. School was getting much more expensive already. Home ownership was already getting more difficult. So multi-level marketing just morphed right up into that group. And it came in the form of companies that appealed to environmental questions, companies like New Skin, Herbalife, and others that really started going after it. They also discovered that you mentioned males being providers. Well, of course, by the 80s and 90s, that was long history.
Yeah.
Women were actually under much greater financial pressure than men
Yeah, you're right.
because they were, we had divorce. So there were lots of single women out there with children trying to get by. Even if they had a spouse, the spouse's jobs were never secure anymore, and 2 incomes were needed.
Right.
So women were thrown into the workforce, and not that they should never have been, but they were in one way or the other. They're in it, but they also had children, and they had still lingering, I say lingering, massive discrimination on income and inequality and
Yep.
certain jobs that were cut off from women and
Yeah.
so on. So multi-level marketing suddenly became a women's scheme, a target. They became the main target. So all this happened as I was researching I decided eventually to write something. And I started writing, at first I was just going to try to write an article. But when multi-level marketing came into South Florida, the same people who had recruited me to the airplane gang called me up.
Yep.
Robert, you've got to get in this. I said, look, I already looked in. It's a pyramid scheme. No, this is a business. This is an income opportunity.
They rebranded.
These are corporations. This is legal. And this is the new form of business and entrepreneurship, and everybody's a boss, and so on. Well, by then that was the mantra of the whole country. Everybody was talking like that. So it had an aura of credibility, legitimacy, institutional support somehow. Economics was now elevated. Business, economics, jobs, work had become the new form of pathway to fulfillment. More so than religion. It became the religion, but it brought with it all the elements of religion: salvation, infinity, fulfillment, happiness, community, a set of moral codes, and all this. So I said, well, then I had to really, investigate multi-level marketing at that point. But it swept through South Florida like a hurricane, and people were joining en masse in multi-level marketing companies. Essentially, though, driven by the same needs, economic and emotional needs, as the airplane game. So I could see the clarity of the pyramid scheme now inside this new structure of a pseudo business, a so-called business.
Yeah, it is pseudo. And I appreciate that, distinction you made, because we were feeling similar anxieties. And so again, I joined Isogenics in 2016 and they started in 2002. So right around that same time you were talking about. And so something that I am really grateful for you to touch on, because there is so much this myth that not all MLMs are bad. And even in some of the recent episodes I was reflecting back on, they are also too afraid to call them all a scam. I was looking back, they're like, how do we evaluate an MLM? That's what I put in one of my episodes. I was like, what am I doing? Oh my gosh. So this is what we need to break down.
Yeah, I went through exactly the same journey. Once I saw what multi-level marketing was, it became a question of, well, which ones?
Right.
And I noticed also in my world, after I wrote False Profits, I was immediately contacted by CBS 60 Minutes and asked to be on a national television news show. And when I look back on that, I thought, how did that happen? Well, it turned out nobody else had actually addressed this phenomenon of multi-level marketing. Now, that was already in the late 1990s, almost up into 2000, when I was contacted. So it had been in existence, let's date it at 1950, and we're up almost 50 years. And nobody had seriously, there had been a couple small books. One very good book had been written by a man named Stephen Butterfield, but he passed away early. And I did speak with his son, and he kind of said to me, well, my father got in writing about that. He was the only one on the whole planet writing about it. He got tremendous pushback and attacks. I think that anxiety and all that came on him contributed to his death.
Oh, yeah.
He actually said that to me. And so I thought, my God, this is really bizarre. Nobody's talking about this, Well, 60 Minutes wanted to do this piece on a prosecution, one of these rare prosecutions of a multi-level marketing company was being prosecuted by the Attorney General's office, North Carolina. They needed somebody to explain it.
Right.
There wasn't anybody. So I had by writing this book, I had created something. I created a document that was kind of the first such document that examined this thing that was all over the place.
Yeah.
After that, I got called by a law office that was suing Amway. Amway was using popular music, without paying royalties on it, copyright.
Yeah.
The lawyer said, look, we understand copyright law. We don't need you for that. But Amway is arguing that music that they are using has no economic value to them. So they can't be held, they don't have to pay. They'll pay a royalty for having violated the copyright law. But we know that music was being used to generate somehow millions and millions of dollars because this is a multi-billion-dollar company. So we don't understand this company. How does this thing work? And we know a judge and jury won't understand it either.
Right.
So we need somebody to explain it. That led me into a whole, eventually 40 different cases that I was involved in. But unfortunately, it drew me into this question of legality, which really pulled me away from the fundamental philosophical, spiritual, sociological questions. It also pulled me away from the understanding they're all the same.
Yeah.
But when the government prosecutes one of them out of hundreds and hundreds, they are implying, and a local, an individual citizen could infer that apparently these others are not illegal, but they found one that was. So this whole myth of a distinction grew not from analysis, but just from general practice. The fact that virtually none were prosecuted, but occasionally one was. If that all makes sense. So
It does, yeah.
Eventually I did get back to the question, what is, and I had a good colleague, a man named John Taylor, Dr. John Taylor, and he's since passed away. And John and I started looking at the question, everybody's talking about legal and illegal, but first we have to define multi-level marketing itself. What is it? It's a distinct type of business. We can see them, we can identify them, they're measurable. So what are their characteristics that separate them from other businesses? So that's what led him and me into this analysis of the basic, what is multi-level marketing? And I've done so much writing about that.
Yeah.
My book, Ponzinomics, really is that. That's what it was. What is it?
It is so in-depth, and it goes into anything that he's touched based on today, like the politics behind it, the 1972 ruling, 79?
79, yes.
Yeah, 79. And so he goes all into that in the books that we've linked in the show notes. So I definitely highly recommend that. And so, the bottom line is that no MLM is legitimate, regardless of the company or product, right?
Yeah, but I think it requires saying why.
Right.
So that is not a prejudice. That is not a bias. It's not an opinion.
Right.
It's really very simple. It does not require a great deal of analysis. If you just look at the 4 hallmarks of multi-level marketing, what are they? And the first one is the endless chain.
Right.
Right. You're supposed to be selling a product, but the number of salespeople can be infinite, unlimited. How could that be? You live in one city, Portland, Oregon. How many salespeople can there be for Amway? There's got to be a limit, right? They can't be everybody.
Or even at the gym. Even at the gym, if you have like too many personal trainers, like
exactly,
that's not going to work out. Yeah.
Or any other business,
right?
Dry cleaning business, whatever, chiropractor.
Right.
You can only have so many. So there's the first characteristic that is unique. The second is you always have to pay to get in. There's always a flow of money. Then there's a reward system that is requires recruiting. There is money to be made, but primarily the money to be made requires that you bring in other people. So there's a recruiting mandate. So there's an endless chain. There's a pay to play. There's a recruiting mandate. And then the last one is also unique to multi-level marketing. If you just think of it as based on sales, they always tell you it's based on sales. Well, if it were actually based on sales, how do people get paid? So if you look at the compensation plan and look at the outcome of the compensation plan, and many of them do disclose who gets how much money, and you see that the top 1% wound up getting over 50% of all the money, sometimes 70 to 80%. How could that be? Well, break their pay plan down, and you see that unlike a real sales company, where you make the sale, you get the majority of the money on commission on that sale. Your manager gets a piece, his manager gets a little piece, and maybe the national or international manager gets a tiny piece. But if you take the total dollars on every transaction, the person closest to the transaction gets most. Multi-level marketing turns it on its head. So I called that an extreme money transfer. Of course, those four characteristics are exactly the defining characteristics of a pyramid scheme. An endless chain, you pay, your money is going to be the money that filters up. You have to recruit if you're going to get in on the money. And the pay or compensation plan or reward plan, whatever you want to call it, is based on the money from the bottom flowing directly to the top. So that is what a pyramid scheme is. It's unsustainable. It's inherently unfair. And up until 1979 was regarded as illegal.
And that's
so now we have, let's say, de facto legality, which maybe is not the same as lawfulness, but it is legal. It will always produce 99% loss rate. It has to, by its design. So I looked at, and John and I, between us, at perhaps 500-600. I personally looked at about 400 MLMs over my years here. John had done similar, some were overlapped. And we realized they're all identical. They all fit this model. And those are the essential defining characteristics of the model, the business model. Now, there are other characteristics about cult mentality and persuasion methods and ideology and so on. But when you break it down, and because they call themselves businesses, you see that it doesn't really matter whether they sell toothpaste or weight loss powder or weight gain powder or anti-aging or leggings. It doesn't matter. That's irrelevant to the model. The model is the same. Each one, these are the universal characteristics of multi-level marketing. And so it becomes a distinction without a difference between a pyramid scheme and a multi-level marketing scheme. They're all the same. Now, that being said, it is important for the individual person to know that if you dare say, well, if that's true, then X company is an illegal scheme, it's really a pyramid scheme, can get you into, in our current law system, can get you sued. And I've been sued. And it's not something anybody wants to do. So I personally now will never say to any, and I advise every podcaster to do this, to put in a disclaimer. I'm not saying that any particular company is an illegal company or a criminal enterprise or anything like that. People got to take the information and apply it on their own. But my basic message is, there's no difference. When somebody says, what's the difference between MLM and multi-level marketing? What's the difference between multi-level marketing and a pyramid scheme? Then my answer is, well, why would you think there is a difference? Well, because the Federal Trade Commission, okay, can you name one of the multi-level marketing companies that the Federal Trade Commission currently has identified as legitimate? Since they say they're mostly legitimate, could they just point to one? They've pointed to the ones that the few they prosecuted, 30 or 40 over decades and decades, that they say were illegal. So point me to one that they would say, now there it is. There's the model. There's one. Look, any of them that look and act like that one, we'd say is legal. They never do it, not once. So it's a myth. It's a myth, and it lives because people don't really want to think. Now, let me go one step further. If you take that further, you inevitably are led into the question, how could that be?
Right.
Okay. How could this be? Well, that's why in Ponzinomics I went through that. Well, here's how it's politically protected. That's the only way this could endure. It has to enjoy political protection.
Yep.
And then it has been driven through enormous messaging into the mindset, popular mindset, that MLM's business opportunity of a lifetime. Get in now.
Yeah, you can't miss
So,
it.
yeah. So the average person should not be faulted for falling into this, because all the authorities tell you you're not doing anything wrong.
Right. Yeah. And you feel like it does give it that sense of legitimacy. Speaking of a myth and people not wanting to, kind of the cognitive dissonance in that, I guess, I highlighted this part of on page 169 in False Profits. A dissenter speaks is the headline. How then does one review a Bible which, by definition, is founded on faith? It could be muckracked. Is that how you say that?
Muckraking.
Muckraking and exposed, but the faithful would only cling to the core beliefs, even as the historical validity and literal truthfulness of their scriptures were revealed to be mythical. And so we have touched on that on the podcast about the myth behind the Christianity, the myth behind Jesus, and how difficult it can be for people to address, cognitive dissonance in general. That's by definition of what it is. And I've been there. I've examined my faith. I've fallen out of a lot of belief systems, and it can be like you're walking from solid ground to walking on water, pun intended. It can be very unsettling. And so we understand why people might not want to go there. I mean, I remember sitting in those meetings and seeing that little income disclaimer, and I didn't want to look into that. I don't know why, but when I look at pharmaceutical ads and they have their little disclaimers, I definitely take those seriously for some reason. I don't know where that didn't. So,
Yeah.
speaking of religion, I am obsessed with theology. Like, I have multiple 600-page theology books. That's what I read for fun because, I don't know. Do you remember that old movie from the 80s, The Robot, Johnny Number 5? Used to read. He's like, need input. That's how I feel a lot reading these books. And so I was so interested when you mentioned Puritan theology and the prosperity consciousness stuff and the false prophets. And because I've studied Puritan thought, like I said. I mean, I live in Virginia now, which is where I was born and raised. And so obviously, this is Jamestown. I mean, I live in Yorktown, Virginia, probably one of the most patriarchal places here by Williamsburg. But I never caught the angle that you were talking about as that Puritan theology linked financial success with common good. And it was like a sense of virtue that if you had wealth, it was seen as a public duty to put back into the community, and how really beneficial that was. That was really fascinating for me to break down. I'd never caught that angle before. And so how did those old religious ideas morph into this prosperity gospel or prosperity consciousness that we see today, and how had MLMs tapped into that mindset?
Yeah. So I tried to, as I said, when I was caught up in the airplane game, and I heard these ideas of of prosperity, abundance, my destiny. The universe wants you to be prosperous. The only reason you're not is that you have negative thinking, limited thinking, scarcity thinking. You're holding it out from you. You're preventing wealth from flowing. God intends this for you to be healthy and wealthy. And poverty is a mindset. And if you're poor, it's only because of your mind. Well, somehow this washed over me as like, yeah, sounds about right. I didn't really carefully examine it, but that was the basis of the airplane game. As I said, they didn't have a corporate structure. They didn't have a company. They didn't have a product, but they had that story. And the story is part of this ideology behind multi-level marketing. Because when you get into an MLM meeting, it's saying exactly the same thing. Exactly the same thing. So I realized there's a belief and there's a set of values being taught that I apparently believed and accepted. And when the airplane game came and gave me a vehicle that said, well, this is it. This is where it all manifests. It's like, of course, I'm ready. And so when it collapsed and I saw that behind it all was pyramid scheme, Well, that set me off into where in the world first of all, where did pyramid schemes come from? And then how did the pyramid scheme get linked up with this abundance thinking, this prosperity thinking? And why did I accept it so readily? And I can't tell you exactly how that led me into, it put me into an inquiry. And I can't exactly tell you if I had a guide, a mentor. I don't mean an individual person, could even be a long dead author, uh, something that guided me a bit. But it took me back to the earliest beginnings. Now, I had read in college, I believe, a book by Max Weber, very famous sociology book called The Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism. And Max Weber does exactly that. He traces that of how Christianity during the Reformation broke down this whole feudal system and had to justify money making, which in the medieval times was kind of suspect. Merchants, loaners of money, business people in general were kind of looked on as, there were craftsmen, there were farmers, there were privileged elite aristocracy that were the aristocrats, the rulers, and there were clergy. But business people were not, there weren't very many of them, and they did not have good reputation. So when that system was broken and people were thrown into their own little pieces of religious thinking, so-called Protestant individual denominations that developed, all the various variations that we now have in Christianity, something had to replace that. And money making had to be justified morally, and it was justified morally as sort of God's work. And the Puritan ethic involved frugality, stewardship, hard work, lots of hard work. Calvinism became known for this, that if you're making money, so how convenient for this, that if you're wealthy, you've done God's work, and if you're poor, it's your fault.
Yeah.
This is, let's face it, capitalism is based on, using people's labor and for profit. It has to be now made into a kind of, in the medieval time, it was justified as God's plan. There were the elites, the aristocracy. They were divinely appointed, the divine right of kings. That's gone now. So how do you explain all this? Well, that's how it got merged. The Puritans were the first religion to come here. They are our founding religion. There's a wonderful book that just came out this year by Jane Borden. It's by a national publisher called Cults Like Us.
Oh, I've heard of it.
Yeah.
But I'm going to write it down.
And Cults Like Us, actually, I'm happy to say, extensively quotes from Ponzinomics and False Profits.
Way to go there.
But her premise is that go look at Puritanism and you'll kind of see American culture, and you'll see why we are all prone toward a kind of doomsday thinking that we will escape through salvation. And that's our first setup, that we need to be delivered. Life can't just be as it is now.
Right.
And it has to be delivered here, now. So that led me into quite a study of that. And I won't say that I did it in a truly scholarly way. I read as deeply as I could. Purpose was writing a book. I'm not a teacher. I mean, I'm not involved in the university. I had no financial support for this. I was doing it all by myself.
Yeah.
It was a process of discovery for me. But then I began to see, well, what happened to Puritanism? It gradually began to morph in America into new versions that were milder in their extremism, but never lost that idea of commercial success equating with spiritual um, elevation. And it never lost the idea that those who are wealthy are somehow the blessed ones and the poor are kind of the damned. And that is with us today.
Yes.
So we're all trying to escape that. We're all trying, my God, I don't want to be one of them. I've got to be a successful person. And why can't you just be who you are? So, I traced it through transcendentalism, through eventually New Thought with Ralph Waldo Emerson, Henry David Thoreau. Eventually, it went into New Thought religions, which the most powerful one was Christian Science with Mary Baker Eddy. And Mark Twain, it turns out, saw at that time that Christian Science was so popular that he thought it was going to become the predominant religion in America because it offered salvation here and now.
Yeah.
Here and now. And what was the source of your power? How did you do all this? By thinking, positive thinking. So positive thinking is the opposite of critical thinking.
Mm.
Positive thinking is like negative thinking, Negative thinking is no matter what you see, that ain't going to work. Positive thinking is no matter what you see, it's all for the good. So you can't really critically examine anything. So it shuts down critical thinking. And so along the way, it just became an ideology, a religious ideology for making money. And as we see now, corporations embrace this and teach it in a kind of embedded way. And the thing is, I'm old enough to remember when this was not such a grip on many people. When I was really coming into my workforce and my work life, I used to hear people talking about finding something meaningful to do, useful to do in the world. That was kind of a mandate. Find something to do in the world that makes a difference. And now it's find something to do that will make you wealthy.
Yep.
Yeah. So you can see how that's a setup. I mean, and multi-level marketing would perfectly play upon this by claiming also that the traditional avenues for wealth building have kind of closed off.
Yeah.
And you don't have to be a nihilist to see that. You don't have to be right wing or left wing.
No.
The truth is, even in my own lifetime, I'm just shocked to see this. Home ownership is becoming something that many people will never gain.
Yeah, it's really scary.
Steady job? Nobody has a steady job anymore. Corporate ladder doesn't really exist anymore. Companies are merging, outsourcing, buying and selling. There's no steady corporate type job anymore. If you're just say, well, I'll just take a job and work and try to make a happy life for myself, you're constantly being subverted. Your company gets sold. They lay off people. The salaries are not livable. You can't really live on them. Then costs have risen, insurance, a car, rent, utilities, healthcare.
Yeah.
So multi-level marketing has a wonderful setting in that it can say to you, first of all, you already believe in the American dream, and the American dream sort of equates with prosperity. Pursuit of happiness became pursuit of wealth. in
Yep.
most people's mind. And yet the avenues are closed off. And so, yet you want to say, but the dream is still there. Well, right. The dream is, and here it is. And it's legal and it's a business. That's how you're going to. So it's the last best hope, as
Yeah.
they say. You
I
can
think,
see how people would be herded into these things by the millions. And it would be the message sounds so plausible, reasonable, and in a way, and this is, when I first wrote False Prophets, Megan, I had the first draft of it, and I brought in 12 or 13 of my friends to read the draft. Of course, it's a critique of New Age thinking. Of
right.
course, it was. And when I wrote this, and they read it, and they came in, some of them were furious with me. How dare you? What is your alternative?
Mm.
If positive thinking and prosperity thinking, what is your alternative? And multi-level marketing, some of them were in multi-level marketing. They said, well, what's the alternative? And somebody in the crowd said, get a job, right?
Yeah.
That's the alternative. Go to work, find something to do, get a job. Well, nowadays, even if somebody said get a job, they'd go, I'm trying to get a job.
Yeah.
I'm
My
trying.
my husband's he's finishing up his 20-year military career, which is probably, I mean, that's probably one of the last stable
Yes.
aspects, but you have to go to war for foreign countries and witness some of the most deep corruption, protecting poppy fields in Afghanistan. Like my husband has seen or heard of some stuff that now it just doesn't feel like it morally matched to kind of the same the messaging that they're told. So yeah, but he got his degree in biochemistry and he realized like how difficult it was. So that's why he went into the military, for the stability for that, but the price that he has paid for that. And we are homeowners. We are 40, he's 44. We're on the last cusp. We were really, 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 really blessed with like where we're at. We pinch ourselves every day with this beautiful house and property that we have, and things could change. I have a feeling they might. So I'm just trying to, and we do gardening, and he does bonsai trees, and we have chickens, and we have, I don't know if you heard of hugelkultur beds. We do some permaculture here, and I'd have a butterfly garden. And I'm just trying to bring the meaning into my life, what you were saying, because, we're at the app.
Yes.
And I think we touched on everything, even though I didn't ask you all the questions. You magnificently wove in all the answers that I wanted to touch on. And you really are so elegant and articulate. And I feel like it represents of something that no longer exists so much. Like, I mean, like I said, I'm an elder millennial, so please don't put me with the younger folks. I didn't get my cell phone till I was 20 something, and I'm really grateful for all of that. I just feel like this, the words you use and how you communicate, I feel like it's becoming a relic of the past. And I'm really grateful for your time and your expertise. And so you're just kind of touching on it. So I thought we could close down the interview with this last question about like beyond the MLM mindset. Cause you were just saying like your friends were like, well, what then? Cause you do provide some of this at the end, like a renewed vision is like the section is one of the later sections in False Prophets. Like you gave us some hope. Like, we need to examine ourselves, where were our pitfalls, where were our vulnerabilities, susceptibilities to fall into these mindsets. For me, that was magical thinking, boss babe mentality, and even some of my spiritual life. And then so now what is the direction that you mentioned meaning? So you just want to kind of close down the interview with what would be your proposition for folks, even though times are really difficult. We don't have control over a lot of things, but what do we have control over, and what would be the message that you want to close down the interview with?
Yeah. I should say that the last chapter of False Prophets, remember, was written in 1996 or 7.
Oh yeah, I did want to touch base on like, gosh, if you could like revisit some of your thoughts, some of your concepts here, I think that'd be
Yeah.
interesting because things have.
I think almost all of it holds well, except that last chapter. I was never 100% comfortable. And I did have a co-author, and we worked together on that last chat. That was what we really co-authored, was that last chapter. although she helped me greatly with taking some of the bite out of the rest of it too, because I did have a certain dark, semi-satirical feel, that I was a certain contempt that I had to sort of filter out. But the last chapter, I was told you have to leave people with some hope. As you know, in Ponzinomics, I ended with no hope, but no need for hope.
That's why I couldn't say it. I almost said it, but I was like, nope, nope. But what do we do?
Yeah. So that was my feeling, is you don't need hope in the way it's defined here.
Right.
Because I wouldn't know. I couldn't know. Nobody can really know what an individual needs to do these days. But I think there are a couple of practical considerations. It is a fact that the economy has changed dramatically. That isn't even good enough term. It has changed almost fundamentally in my lifetime. And the American dream is largely closed off in the traditional ways.
Yes.
And I think most people are now falling into looking for dictatorial answers,
Yes.
a great authority leader.
Yeah.
Some are falling into religious cultism of closing their lives down to the nuclear family and not letting their children socialize with other people and staying clear of anyone who doesn't go to their church and believe as they believe. We talked at the beginning of people moving even into certain states where they think they're safer, and so on. So there's obviously you and I are not the only ones facing these questions. Everybody is looking at them. For younger people, which multi-level marketing does aim at younger people, and they do aim at women primarily now. 75% are women. So I had a lot of conversations I was involved in this film called Lula Rich that was about the multi-level marketing LuLaRoe.
Mm-hmm.
And I got quite angry with the film because, LuLaRoe took educated people, women, many of them had children, and as the film shows, infantilized them, turned them into sort of childlike figures, screaming, dancing, standing on their chairs about what? Leggings, selling stretch pants, and they weren't even stylish, they were
They weren't
actually
high quality. Yeah.
they weren't good quality. And then as they showed in the film, after they awakened to the reality that it was a pyramid scheme, were saying, these things are actually ugly. So the product itself transformed right in front of their eyes when they saw the reality of it. And then they began looking at themselves. What was I doing? I went on cruises with these people, and we were like this crazy cult of some kind. And one of the women that's in it says, I was in a cult. I was in a cult. So what was all that about? And I think it was because people were trying their best not to face the difficult economic and social realities that our economy has now presented to them. So what is a more practical reply? I think for each person is going to be different, but I think we are going to come to a state here where not having a lot of money will be an accepted, okay, that's how it's going to be. What else am I going to do with my life? And we may start questioning this Puritan ethic as a guiding principle that if you're not wealthy, you're nobody, that your worth is measured by your wealth. That may start falling apart in America today. And because it just doesn't hold up. It's not usable as a belief system. It doesn't help you. It makes you only sicker. It makes you anxiety. It increases your anxiety and makes you feel bad about yourself.
Yeah.
So what you already suggested certain things that people are probably doing. I live in a little town in the mountains of North Carolina, and I see a lot of people out here trying to find meaning without money.
Yeah.
And they're finding it in nature. They're finding it in growing things. They're finding it in volunteer work. We went through a terrible flood here,
Oh, yeah.
and so many people poured into Hot Springs with supplies and offering, I'll do anything. What do you need?
Yeah, I sent a ton of supplies down.
Yeah. So, I thought there's where the hope
Yeah.
is in community, in doing something that has meaning for people, finding pleasure in natural things that are not commercial, not branded, um, and hopefully in more relationships that are not based on politics.
Or selling, or yeah, like just selling any sort of concept, just being more open-minded about idea. Yeah, just the what am I trying to say? The identity politics, like you said. Like there's well, so Jonathan Haidt, who I mentioned maybe before we push record, he said that he talks a lot about moral psychology, and he said that we have never been this politically divided, or it hasn't been since 1860. And
Yeah,
we know what was going on in the 1860s was the Civil War. I don't want a civil war at all, but it does seem like we're going to be at a breaking point soon. And I would hope that would, this elite versus non-elite, like I'm not really into some of the oppressed versus oppressed kind of Marxist socialist mind frame. So, but I do see that money construct that you were saying, this wealth and blessing and God, that sort of construct, that falling away could be the best gift for all of us. I don't see that really happening with Trump and Paulo White and what's going on with our leadership right now with Hegseth with his friggin' Jerusalem cross on it. I just feel like we are headed towards the Christian Reich or something. And I didn't think that was true. Honestly, last year I was making fun of my friends who were screaming about Christian nationalism. And now I'm like, after Charlie Kirk assassination with the hate, I'm just like, what is going on in our society right now? So I now am eating my words when I was being more moderate last fall. And I'm like, okay. So I'm concerned, but I don't, gosh, I will say that I'm hopeful because I did do a whole podcast about hope molecules. And there's this protein that your body releases when you exercise called myokines. It's kind of like it's a pharmacy within yourself. That's why you get happy when you go for walks. So that's what I'm going to tap into. Maybe we can find up a new word for it, but just through movement, through meaning, like just finding purpose in the day to day, not being
yeah,
forced to let
that's
it wake up
exactly what
here.
I'm referring to.
Yeah,
That's what I'm
the
referring.
shift
And I understand what you're saying. There's no good evidence that there's going to be any outbreak of that currently. In fact,
currently.
it looks to the contrary. But I too don't see that taking route. First of all, Christian nationalism is a tiny minority of people. So the
This is
vast
what I've said.
majority of people
This is what
are
I've said.
not interested in that sort of thing. So,
Yeah,
we shall see. We shall see how it plays out. But at a personal level, in the meantime, everybody is grappling with what to do. What do I do with my life day to day? And I do see a lot of experimentation occurring currently here in this town and in other places. And I see it. I have a family member who was at a bank. He worked 20 some years, just got laid off. He's in the throes of, and he's still, about 50 and it's the early 50s. What am I going to do the rest of my life? And he's also looking at that. Now, that said, there's other forces still at work.
yep.
Crypto speculating, stock speculating, crypto has become and ideologies, extremist ideologies, and those are all still out there.
Yeah.
But I think the majority of people will, on a day-to-day level, or a large number will, in more practical ways, try to find an answer for themselves. And I do see some openings for this.
Yeah, more
But just to
community.
circle it back to multi-level marketing, I think multi-level marketing in the mosaic of alternatives is one of these corrupting, deceptive big lies that play upon all those old themes that we were speaking about of prosperity and happiness coming through that. That also is playing upon the closing off of the American dream. So it's a perfect pseudo false answer, a perfect sting operation, the perfect fertile ground for mass fraud, which is what it perpetrates. But I also see for the first time podcasts, books. I mentioned Jane Borden's book. She lists multi-level marketing. That's why I'm in there in her book as one of these cult responses. And there have been other books now. Bridget Reed's book, Little Bosses Everywhere, is a good reference from a major publisher now, finally.
Yes. She's a little too overgeneralized against conservatives, and that is a very common theme in the anti-MLM community, which upsets me because I am we're military, we live in Virginia, so that has been really a big issue for me with the anti-MLM community, that they do the Darbo tactics that they call out. They literally do the same things to me. They're still in their us versus them mentality sometimes, where if
That's
you,
right.
And that's something that
That's the thing. You carry it over.
You don't even mean
it's
to.
no accident that you were in the MLM cult.
Yeah.
You think you would just leave it all behind? Of course not. You're going to bring your same self. They say, wherever you go, there you are.
Yes, sir. That is 100% true. And that's what I'm constantly trying to challenge myself to make sure that, I think the us versus them mentality is again, that's why the book Righteous Mind, why people are divided by religion and politics is so important, to look into just human evolution, psychology, just more understanding that tribal mentality and how that's built into us. People say it's taught. No, it's not taught. It is xenophobia is not taught. It is actually within us. So we just have to understand our own psychology, I think. And I was going to say, I hope that the shift goes towards more community nurturing, how we can take care of one another, how we can share in one another's skills, and maybe kind of break free from the limits of the American dream shutting down, and then kind of turning towards one another and seeing how we can, I don't know. That's what I just hope.
And we don't know. We just don't know what, for example, I'll give one real quick little thing that I thought was very illuminating to me. Somebody asked Noam Chomsky this question. How is it pointed all the dark things you just described, the economy collapsing, home ownership, all these dark things, authoritarianism spreading, polarization that's occurring. And he said, well, remember that it was rather similar in the 1920s. The 1920s, terrible time for labor, terrible time. We'd just gone through a war, had all these veterans. They didn't get their money, their bonus. It was a really hard time for the average person. We hear about the roaring 20s, but the average person was in real dark time in the 20s until the stock market crashed. And nobody could have imagined the policies that followed, the government employing millions of people, the WPA, building public parks, national forests, the Blue Ridge Parkway, and all these other things, Social Security, all that came out of that. So, there is a strong possibility. I don't wish for that, but there is a strong possibility of an abrupt change in our culture economically. The stock market can't go up forever, and there's all kinds of warnings. So I think, but that's not something to hope for or wait for. I'm just saying that has to be factored in if we're looking ahead. We really don't know.
Yeah,
we don't know.
And we need to be realistic.
But in the meantime, I think the values you've identified, which are very similar to what I think I tried to point to at the end of False Profits too.
Yes.
They are relatively simple things that may not be found in work.
Right. And that's okay. And so I just really appreciate your time today, and for everyone listening. And if you guys have any questions or concerns, I've linked some of his recent articles in the show notes as well. And I highly recommend both of your books. And then you have the pyramidschemealert.org, which is something that you've been working on for a long time. And so I'm just very, very grateful for all of that. So all those resources are in the show notes, guys. And feel free to reach out to Robert if you have any questions or if you want to share some of your own personal experience. And is there anything else you'd like to say as we close down?
I think it was a pleasure for me to explore some of these deeper subjects, Megan. I don't often get asked these things. I'm asked more mundane things about legality and money and counting up average incomes and stuff like that. And so, I started out in these philosophical, spiritual, personal questions, because that's what it all comes down to individually
Yeah,
in your life. And it was a pleasure to get back and to remember that these are important and fundamental.
they are.
They're not to be dismissed or seen as soft questions. They are actually the hard questions.
That is so true. And thank you. It was a real pleasure for me too.